History also provides us with an identity. As you know, the topic is African Muslims in America towards an identity, a purpose, and direction. One of the purposes of history is that history gives us an identity, history gives us a purpose, and history gives us a direction. History is extremely important. Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, rahimahullah, he said, of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research. Of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward all research. When you want to get married to a brother or sister, you got to know their history. You got to know something about them. It's critical. Because their history will give you an insight as to where they're coming from, what they're about. Their history will give you an insight as to their identity. So towards an identity, a purpose, and direction. We're also reminded, brothers and sisters, of, I don't know if some of you read the book. There's a book done not long ago called Bloods. It was dealing with African American men in Vietnam. And it was dealing with the different, Terrence Wallace Terry. He wrote it. They took about 8 or 9 different African American men and talked about their experience in Vietnam. That movie, Dead Presidents. That movie called Dead Presidents was based on one of the segments of that book. A brother who came back from Nam used his expertise to knock off places. It was based on that. But there was one segment in that book talking about a particular brother who was from Cleveland. He was a big brother, and he was a mama's boy. It was just him and mama, you know what I'm saying? And he was a mama's boy. He loved his mama. So nobody messed with his mama, right? He was taken off to Vietnam. And you have to remember that in the Vietnam War, brothers and sisters, that at least 1/4, 25% of those who were serving on the front line of the Vietnam were brothers. Were African American males. So brothers were basically being put on the front line, as well as with Latinos and poor whites. At the same time now, so this brother, he's in Vietnam. He goes to Vietnam, having been a mama's boy. When he gets to Vietnam, he actually develops a reputation in the villages. The reputation that he develops is one in which when he kills Vietnamese, when he kills them, he actually takes their ears off. And he wears their ears on his chest, right? Now, he's also learning some of the language and so on and so forth. So he's getting to know some of the people some of the Vietnamese people who he's not fighting against and so on and so forth. And they end up giving him a nickname that has to do with like being a monster, right? So next thing you know, how those the bandoleros, is that what they call it? When you wear these bullets around? That's how he wore ears, right? So after he did his time in Vietnam, and one of the things that happened in Vietnam is that brothers were taken out of the jungles of Vietnam, right? And then just taken right back to the streets. In many instances, like, for example, in World War II, like, when you go through war, you have to, have a coming down period. You have to have a coming down period. You've been killing all this time and so on and so forth. So sometimes what they did, like in World War II, they would take some of the troops and they maybe go and maybe to Europe, Germany, or where have you, and then they have a coming down period before they're sent back to the States, right? With respect to the Vietnam War, more often than not, brothers were just taken out of the jungles and just sent back home. So this particular brother, the same thing was done to him. Here he is in the jungles of Vietnam, right? Cutting off ears and so on and so forth. The next thing you know, he's back in Cleveland. And he's knocking on his mama's door. His mother does not recognize him. His mother does not recognize him with respect to his, not only his physical appearance, but his mother does not recognize him in terms of how he's acting. You know what I'm saying? Just wild. Like a wild man. So she saw what had happened to her son. So what she did, she whipped some serious psychology on him. She had him to stay in the basement of her house. And each and every day, he's relating this, each and every day, for hours and hours and hours, she would sit with him and remind him how he used to be. He said this went on for hours, for several months. And she used to say and this is what you used to do for me, and you used to be like this. And every time I asked you to do something, you were there, and so on and so forth. And then he said, after a while, after she kept telling him about himself and how he used to be and who he was, he began to come back around. And he said after several months, he said, I was back. But what did she do? She reminded him of his history. She reminded him of his history. A psychologist couldn't have done that. This was moms. And she told him, this is how you used to be. And then he began to reform his identity based on his history, who he is and who he was. Who he was is based on who he is right now, history. The same thing applies to us, brothers and sisters. We have seen African-American Muslims get into so many different trends. One trend that African-Americans tend to get into, and this is something African-American Muslims, and this is something that we have to be very, very careful of. One of the things that we're bringing into Islam, brothers and sisters, as a result of our experiences in the society, is our inferiority complex. We are bringing with us an inferiority complex. It is there, and it is deeply rooted within us. And it's not a question of whether we have it or not. It's a question of how much of it do we have. Just like those whites in the society. It's not a question of whether or not they're racist or not. It's a question of not whether or not how much of it they have in them. Of course, you might as well assume that they're racist. That's a part of the socialization process. Just like men play with footballs and girls play with Barbie dolls, it's in the socialization process. This racism is in the socialization process. This superiority attitude is in the socialization process, and our inferiority attitude is in the socialization process. So African Americans bring with them, some of the luggage that we bring with us is this inferiority complex. And there have been certain trends that try to take advantage of this inferiority complex. Right? So we have seen many African-American Muslims, when they come to Islam, we've seen African-American Muslims come to Islam, and next thing you know, they got an accent. No, they're speaking with an accent, straight up. They're speaking with an accent. Accent. And actually have the belief that what we can have here in this country and our understanding of Islam in this country, irrelevant. We got to go to get the real thing. And when they go and get the quote-unquote real thing, it takes them totally away from who they actually are. And although they may have gotten the real thing, they can no longer relate to their people anymore. Because they are so, quote unquote, high up. They can't relate to the brothers in the streets. They can't relate to their people, period, anymore. So what has